Today we're going to get started. So today we have some big news to share. We released a report about the Transportation Diversity Council and their relationship with New Flyer. And we also filed a complaint with the New York Attorney General asking her office to review the Transportation Diversity Council's nonprofit status and potential conflicts of interest that are inconsistent with its exempt purposes. I'm Miranda Nelson. I am the New York, New Jersey director of Jobs to Move America, and I'll be hosting this today. And so just briefly for a little bit of background, New Flyer is the largest bus manufacturer in North America. They reap the benefits of our public dollars through public contracts with transit agencies across the country, including the MTA here in New York. They also get direct subsidies from the state of Alabama. And we believe that a company that gets that much support from our public coffers should be held accountable for workers and communities. New Flyer recently formed a relationship with the Transportation Diversity Council, which holds itself up as independent, but we have really dug deep into this relationship, and they really seem to be acting on behalf of New Flyer. And its president and CEO has penned op-eds and provided quotes for press releases defending New Flyer at every turn. And we think it's really not fulfilling its duty to the public interest. So that's what our report is about, and that's what we filed the complaint about, and we're gonna talk a bit more about that today. So first we'll hear from Dean Hubbard, who authored the report, and Scott Cummings, an expert from UCLA on community benefits agreements, and they'll share more about our concerns with TDC and New Flyer. And then we'll hear from some of our Alabama partners, Charles Crooms and Scott Douglas. They've been working with workers and community members in Alabama to get a real community benefits agreement with New Flyer. And after all that, we will have time for questions. So I'm going to kick it off by passing it off to Dean, who is the author of our report, Diversity for Hire, Astroturfing, New Flyer, and the Transportation Diversity Council. Dean, do you want to talk more about the report and then the complaint we filed?
Sure, thanks Miranda, and hello everybody. One other just bit of background that I would like to add is that Alabama A&M University researchers learned from workers at JMA's Alabama factory about concerns they have about race and gender discrimination, harassment, and retaliation at that factory in Alabama. New Flyer refused to negotiate with the coalition in Alabama, which I'm sure Charles and Scott will discuss. And instead, they hired the Transportation Diversity Council to run a corporate reputation laundering campaign, which we refer to in the report as astroturfing. Our report found that TDC, the corporate consultant that New Flyer hired to run the astroturf campaign, has a checkered track record from conflicts of interest involving its president and CEO to claiming to its members and to the public that it is influencing members of Congress while telling the IRS that they do no lobbying. All the evidence that we found through months of research points to the relationship between TDC and New Flyer being an astroturf kind of relationship. New Flyer hired this consultant to create basically an illusion of grassroots support for an involvement in what is in reality a PR document that they call a framework agreement that is meant to undermine the coalition that is organizing to hold the company accountable. This framework document that New Flyer and TDC released is deeply flawed. For one, it says New Flyer will be accountable to New Flyer. It will report to New Flyer and to TDC. That means there's no real mechanism to enforce any of the commitments that the company says it is making or to otherwise hold the company accountable. The framework also includes absurd goals like creating a social service program for workers in need at New Flyer's Alabama plant. And it's quite obvious that if New Flyer simply paid its workers a living wage, there wouldn't be a need for such a social service program. There are plenty of other examples of why this document is nothing more than corporate PR. I'm happy to go into them during the questions and answers. But I also just wanted to briefly mention the complaints with the New York Attorney General and the IRS that were filed yesterday, asking them to investigate several potential violations of law by TDC. These include that TDC reports consistently to the IRS that its president and CEO works for it for 40 hours a week, but receives no compensation from TDC. So we have asked the IRS and the New York Attorney General to investigate who is compensating who for the work that TDC's president and CEO does in TDC's name, but says is on behalf of New Flyer. TDC also told the IRS that they have a conflict of interest policy that is available to the public, but they refused to provide it to members of the public. We've asked the IRS to investigate and the Attorney General to investigate whether TDC has engaged in what are called related party transactions or violated the rights of its members. And finally, we have pointed out to the New York Attorney General that TDC has failed to file the reports that it is required to file every single year with the Attorney General since at least 2016. So with that, I am going to stop. And I am going to turn it over now to Scott Cummings, who is an expert on community benefits agreements and is the Robert Henningsen Professor of Legal Ethics and a Professor of Law at.
I think it's now my turn, Dean. You froze. But thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me here. As Dean mentioned, I teach and study economic development, among other things, at UCLA. And I actually wrote a book that's coming out soon on community benefits agreements in Los Angeles. And so I've studied when they work, when they don't work. And I've carefully reviewed the New Flyer community benefits framework in this particular case. So what I wanted to do was to speak briefly about what community benefits agreements are, what they are not, and why the framework put forward by New Flyer does not qualify as a genuine community benefits agreement, or CBA, as I will often refer to it. There are really two keys to genuine, authentic CBAs, and they are community accountability on one hand and enforceability on the other hand. And as I'll mention, these two elements are really closely related. Accountability generally works through authentic community-based partnerships with representatives drawn from effective communities. In this case, it would be workers, labor groups, and members of communities in which New Flyer's manufacturing sits in Alabama. And this robust community representation really facilitates genuine negotiation between community members and the company, and negotiation then results in an enforceable agreement in which the company makes promises that go beyond its existing practices and can really be monitored and enforced by community groups on the ground. Enforceability is really the other key element of CBAs, and it works through the articulation of clear standards with clear timelines, and really importantly, community-based monitoring mechanisms that allow for community organizations and workers to gain access to available data so they can actually know whether or not companies are actually complying with their agreements. So accountability and enforcement are really interlocking in this particular respect. So having reviewed the New Flyer community benefits framework, from my perspective, the framework fails on both the accountability and enforcement fronts, and it's the reason that they call it a framework and not a community benefits agreement. First, there is no community representation, authentic community representation that informs the development of the framework. As Dean indicated, Transportation Diversity Council was selected by New Flyer, which refused to negotiate with community groups in Alabama promoting a benefits agreement. Community groups and workers were not involved in the development of the framework, and there was no authentic negotiation of the terms that were ultimately put out. In a gesture to the community, the framework, if you read it carefully, and I'm happy to go into more details during Q&A, but if you read it carefully, does refer to a so-called employee engagement committee, but this is not a substitute for authentic community participation. Instead, the committee referred to in the New Flyer framework was selected by New Flyer. It's advisory only. It doesn't have any specified powers. And if you look at the description of what it does, it is really rests on pretty vague standards and terms. As a result, the language in the framework is very lofty, but vague in essential ways that really undercut its enforceability. So there are no clear standards, timeframes for implementation, enforcement mechanisms, or monitoring mechanisms. And I could give several examples, but let me just focus on one here, which relates specifically to the provisions organized around wages and workforce development. In this particular section of the framework, New Flyer says it's committed to providing wages that meet or exceed regional prevailing wage standards, but these standards are not specified. There's no description of what happens if New Flyer doesn't comply. There's no time frame for how long New Flyer has to implement these standards. And there's importantly no indication of who actually gets to see wage data and therefore monitor compliance. So these are all things that you would see in a typical and authentic community benefits agreements that are absent in the New Flyer framework. Another kind of classic strategy that companies sometimes use to present themselves as engaged in authentic community benefits negotiations, but actually avoiding any enforceability, is to promise to do things that they're already required under existing law to do. And there are, again, a number of examples of this in the framework around environmental compliance and diversity compliance, where you see New Flyer is essentially saying that it will comply with existing law and not actually raise standards in any meaningful way that will help workers. So I would say overall, the real failure of the framework can be seen by sort of asking what happens if New Flyer doesn't do what it says it is going to do in the framework. What if it doesn't hire diverse workers or fails to pay prevailing wage? And in my review, there's really nothing New Flyer workers or community members could do about any failure on the part of New Flyer, because there is no contractual relationship that would allow them to enforce. And the last point I just want to make, which I think is really important to emphasize in terms of the real weaknesses of this framework relative to promoting community accountability, is that community groups can't even try to hold New Flyer to its standards, even as they're presented in this framework, because they don't have access to any data and any information. And the Transportation Development Committee is not obligated, as far as I can tell, to release any of it to the community. And this is a really significant flaw, because without information, obviously, there is no ability to hold the company to account.
Thanks so much, Scott. That was really helpful. So next we're going to hear from some of the people who've been organizing for a real community benefits agreement, one that would actually live up to the standards that Scott just laid out, and to explain a little bit more about why we want it. So first we'll hear from Charles Crooms, who is a former New Flyer worker and has been organizing among, has been talking to workers and community members in Anniston, Alabama, where he lives.
Thank you, Miranda.
Yeah.
That's right. I'm an ex-employee of New Flyer. When I first started working there, I figured this was a job that I would enjoy doing. But as I stayed there, I realized that this was not, in the normal sense, a facility that operated in fairness. Like I said, I used to work for New Flyer, and I know from firsthand experience that the company consistently denies workers a voice on the job. I've seen firsthand the issues that the Alabama A&M researchers, found in their survey of New Flyer workers: racial discrimination, mandatory overtime, retaliation, and a lot more. And a lot of the workers that I have been in contact with, I can say that they have told me that they haven't had any contact with any staff representatives of TDC. They may have heard them mentioned in a meeting, but as far as any interaction with workers, nothing. So to see the company that I used to work for go to great lengths to hire, a corporate consultant to undermine simple demands for accountability and dignity is disappointing, to say the least. This framework that TDC touts it doesn't satisfy our demands for a voice on the job. We want New Flyer to come to the table to negotiate a real CBA, and we won't rest until they do.
Thank you, Charles. And so now I'm going to pass it off to Scott Douglas, who is the director of Greater Birmingham Ministries and a member of the Alabama Coalition for Community Benefits. And he also co-authored the foreword to the report. Scott, can we hear from you?
Unmute myself. Thank you. I'm honored to be among those workers and advocates who are fighting for a better life and a better community for the workers of New Flower and then people around all their plant. As the conditions of workers go to conditions in the communities they come from. So it's not just inside the plant quality of life we're fighting for, but the quality of life of all of our communities where the workers come from. So I want to say that every job in New Flower should be a good one, the kind of job that can support working families. And we are quite tired here in Alabama of our workers being picked on by companies that come to this state, and instead of offering the benefits of workers in other states, they give us what I call Alabama portions of things. Alabama portions of rights, Alabama portions of wages. Alabama, that's enough for Alabama. Well, enough is enough. And we're sick and tired of what's enough for Alabama, of using lower standards of what some companies use than they use in other countries, much less in other states for Alabama. We're better than that, and we're about to show it. So we're standing behind the workers at New Flowers, Anderson plant, to say enough is enough, and we deserve better. We need decent quality with environmentally safe jobs, workplaces, and communities. And Alabama has been a cash cow in subsidies for decades now, in terms of bringing massive corporations from around the world where our workers work for less and get less benefits over time. So we, citizens and residents of Alabama, are up in arms and angered and getting united behind making sure that our public jobs have public responsibility and responsibility to the public, do better by their workers in the communities where they set up. So we don't want Alabama anymore to be slave labor bait, and we're gonna stand up and fight it. So thank you very much.
So thanks so much, everyone, for sharing. It's really great to hear from all of you and our coalition that we are working with and building, and as we go ahead and make our demands for a real community benefits agreement with New Flyer that actually negotiates with the community. We now have time for questions. I believe what you can do is either raise your hand, there should be a button to raise your hand, or you can type your question into the chat box. Would anyone like to ask a question? I see Jay Mehta has raised his hand. I think you can go ahead and talk.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So just this morning on the New Flyer earnings call, they mentioned that internal surveys saying that workers at the Anderson plant it's a great place to work. Charles, or others too, like what do you say about that? Because they're still saying that the internal surveys say it's great.
I can say to that, Jay, having been an employee there, I remember taking a survey like the one that he's referring to. We were given a survey and the workers knew to fill it out in a sense where you weren't saying anything against the company as far as workers answering honest. The fear of being singled out because even if you filled out the survey anonymously, there's a sense that they can tell where it came from. And the overall fear of saying something negative is quite real because workers have seen other workers, rode hard, whereas when they got on the boss's nerves, they had extra work involved on them. And to that survey, I would actually this is just me speaking. Like the challenge Paul Suvi to show his survey, and then we'd like to show our survey that we conducted with Alabama A&M, just to be all transparency, just to see what type of questions that he really do ask the workers. And we will really see, you know, what the truth is behind that, because with what I'm hearing from workers, there's no 90% workers being happy about how the company operates.
One of the problems that was cited repeatedly in the Alabama A&M survey was this fear of retaliation, that if people spoke out that they would be retaliated against. Or 4 out of 12 people who did make some sort of complaint said that they experienced some retaliation, which I think was really, really powerful and disturbing. Would anyone else like to speak to that question? Brandon, I saw that you had your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Hi, sorry, figuring out the tech. So a group of unions in New York also sent a letter to New Flyer, and I'm wondering what is the role of organizations in New York and unions there in this campaign?
Absolutely, thanks, Brandon. So a coalition of unions and community groups in New York sent a letter to New Flyer expressing real concerns about their work with this New York-based nonprofit. The coalition of unions talked about how they stand in solidarity with the workers and community in Alabama, with the Alabama Coalition for Community Benefits, and they would like to see a real community benefits agreement. They think that a New York organization shouldn't just go into Alabama and shouldn't act as an AstroTurf entity for New Flyer. And so we had unions including the Transport Workers Union, the Communication Workers of America, the United Auto Workers, and SMART, the sheet metal workers, all signed on to this letter, along with Align and the Unitarian Universalists, and there's one more. It'll come to me. I will let you know when I get it. And you know, they all express concerns about New Flyer and their activities here. So we really like to see that that changed. Thanks for asking, Brandon. Would anyone else like to ask a question? Oh, I see Aiden has a question.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was wondering if you could explain some examples of TDC's bad practices that are cited in the complaint.
Yeah. Dean, would you like to take that one?
Sure. So as I mentioned, there are a whole bunch of questionable at best practices by TDC that we have asked the New York Attorney General and the IRS to investigate. I think really the principal concern out of all of them is just what exactly is Dwayne Sampson's relationship to New Flyer and who is paying him. Because he says he's working 40 hours a week for TDC, but he also says he's getting no money from TDC. So we would like to know how much is New Flyer paying and who are they paying it to? There are also concerns we have about, for example, the fact that TDC in its bylaws is formed as a membership organization. It solicits dues from basically anybody who wants to pay dues on its website, but it has told the IRS repeatedly that it is not a membership organization. And they actually did not report any income from membership dues until 2018. Similarly, TDC solicits contributions on its website for scholarships and for sponsorships. But we were not able to find any reference to any either income or expenditures for scholarships or sponsorships in what TDC provided to the IRS. So that's just a couple of examples that you'll find in the 41 page complaint about potential violations of law by TDC.
And that is all on our website, which maybe someone could put in the chat box. I saw a question from Jessica Goodhart.
Hi. This is a question about how the New Flyer plant in Anniston is handling the outbreak of COVID cases at the plant. And I know that, and whether you think having a community benefits agreement in place would make a difference, during this pandemic.
Charles, do you want to talk a bit from your experiences talking to workers at the
Sure. Yeah, talking to workers, the workers feel that the guidelines that New Flyer put in practice to safeguard against the virus, they feel that the guidelines are enough. As currently today, Alabama is in essence a hotspot, and the rate of infection appears to be growing within the plant because I get reports from workers that so many workers were sent to be tested, so many workers had tested positive. The workers do know that the spread is in the plant, and the air that I'm getting from them, or the sense that I'm getting from them is what New Flyer is doing enough. Because if a worker that I've spoken to, which this is a true story, a worker came in contact with another worker that was positive. Did positive, but a few days later, the worker that tested positive was out sick, and the worker that came in contact, he did end up going to get tested. The point that he raised to me was, in between that testing time, there's supposed to be a 14-day quarantine period, whereas within that 14 days, there's a determination of whether that person actually has it, or is he just asymptomatic and not testing positive on the test. So just, it seems to the workers that even though they know that their coworkers are testing positive, they're not going through the proper CDC guideline standards as far as, let's make sure that these persons that came in contact are quarantined, let's make sure that they don't have it. At the same time, a simple test like taking a worker's temperature before he goes into work, that can be a prevention or an indication that a worker may be sick, that would prevent that worker from contaminating someone else, and they could stop that worker from coming in. So small suggestions are coming up by the workers of things, questions that they want answered, of why the company isn't doing a bit more. And at the same time, yeah, the workers understand that having a job at this time is crucial, because with so many people being laid off, being evicted, the reality is you have to be able to pay your bills and take care of your family. They're willing to take the chance. All the ones that I've spoken with, the workers are doing all they can to prevent themselves from catching the virus. So it's a time that the uncertainty is building in the workers, because they're looking at what's going on as far as their protection and what more can be done. But that voice to voice that to management isn't there in the plant. And that's one way that I truly believe that a CBA would help the workers, just to give them a voice to speak up if they feel that the company, maybe they can do more. That's something I think a CBA would help.
Thank you.
Scott, Douglas, I don't know if you have any further thoughts on how a CBA could help. Oh, you're muted still.
I think Charles did an excellent job putting out really this whole time being present today. Good to see you, Charles. Of the complex, critical vices that workers, especially workers of color, get put in here in Alabama. You got to choose between a low-wage job or no job at all. You got to choose between working under infectious conditions or no jobs at all. You know, and I appreciate the work of him and other valiant workers there for fighting for the day where a community benefit agreements means you don't have to choose between your life and your job or your family and your health and health of yourself and your family and the job. And so I really appreciate y'all, Charles, and the workers there for standing up.
Thank you. I see Hector Hueso has a question.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I saw news recently that New Flyer had some pretty concerning practices at its St. Cloud facility with getting workers back on the job. But there seemed to be, I think, some recourse for those employees because I believe they have a union. What are some of the differences between what workers are experiencing at that facility versus the Anniston location?
I can do my best to take that, or I can start. Maybe Charles, if you have additional thoughts from having spoken with people, that would be helpful. So at the St. Cloud facility, there is both St. Cloud and Crookston, Minnesota. There are the workers there are unionized with the Communication Workers of America, and they have found that there is a lot of ways that this is helpful. They've been able to talk to management about coronavirus specifically and have been able to negotiate what health and safety practices should be in the plant. So for example, they do get temperature checks in Minnesota. They also have been able to work through other problems as they've come up. But there are there is at least this one key problem, which is that they had negotiated an agreement around return to work being voluntary, and they weren't able, and the company unilaterally withdrew from that agreement. And Dean, actually, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So yeah, as Miranda is pointing out, one of the key differences is that because the workers in the Minnesota factories are unionized, the company, when they want to make a significant change that would affect the workers' terms and conditions of employment, they do have an obligation to negotiate with the workers' representatives, which is an obligation they don't have in Alabama and that they are trying very desperately to avoid having. As Miranda pointed out, the union for those workers in Minnesota, CWA, did negotiate initially with New Flyer that in the midst of the pandemic shutdown, if New Flyer wanted someone to come in and work, that would be voluntary. What Miranda's talking about is New Flyer changed their mind, is not enough people were volunteering and coming forward. So they just unilaterally altered the agreement, and the CWA has filed charges with the National Labor Relations Board, and those are presently being adjudicated. Without a union, without that collective bargaining agreement, you don't have the ability to challenge an employer's unilateral action of that type. So that, I think, would be one of the key differences.
And Charles, have you discovered any other differences between Minnesota and Alabama that you want to highlight?
What I noticed lately is that it seems that New Flyer is trying to keep up with what they give the workers in Minnesota and St. Cloud and Crookston, and basically because of JMA's actions on attending the APTA conference and speaking to buyers and reaching out to get support for fair treatment for workers through a community benefits agreement. And so New Flyer sees that the workers, they can see what St. Cloud and Crookston is doing through Facebook. So when there's a complaint, the workers in Alabama can see, whereas before JMA shook the bushes, so to speak, there was a separation of Anniston facility and the Minnesota facility. So the island of Anniston was alone by itself and no other company affiliated with New Flyer mattered. And the workers were told that their work was a big bulk of the company and that their work really mattered. And the workers bought into that. So them trying to look at what St. Cloud or Crookston is doing or getting was not in the on the radar of workers. But now the workers are understanding that, especially during coronavirus, we want to make sure that we're taken care of, being non-union comparatively to union companies. So the workers slowly are taking notice to what is happening in St. Cloud and Crookston, and then this engagement is getting them informed that they do need to speak up on their behalf, and that's one of the things that being in the non-union plant is trying to get the workers to be aware of what's happening from the same employer that has a company that's unionized, up north, but we're not here down south.
Can I give just one example what I'm
Sure.
about that has evolved?
Yeah, you're a little frozen, so.
Okay.
Go
Well, hopefully
ahead
you all
with your
can hear
example.
me. But I think a good example of what Charles is talking about is that the Minnesota workers through their union were able to negotiate with New Flyer that the company would pay for health insurance for people while they were out of work due to the pandemic for up to 3 months. Before that happened, my understanding is that they were not offering that in Alabama. And after that happened, they did.
That's a helpful example. Thanks, Dean. Does anyone else have any questions? All right, then. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're really excited to share our research with you, and also share all the work that our coalitions in New York and Alabama are doing to build worker and community power and fight for a real community benefits agreement. Really hold some of these corporations accountable. So thank you so much.